The May and June Journées had proven to be resounding successes for the insurrectionary Commune. Not only had they effectively decapitated the Girondins, but they had also put their allies, the Jacobins, in charge of the National Convention. But therein lies the problem. The Commune had put the Jacobins in charge. The sections of Paris had risen up to install a new national government, a government that no one had voted in, which had been installed by means of a violent coup. So the Jacobins found themselves in a bit of a pickle. Though the coup was obviously an incredible boon, putting them in the driver's seat for the first time in a long time, they were now effectively at the mercy of the insurrectionary Commune. This was a revolution in miniature, one that came from the bottom up. An implied threat would now hang over their every action, decree and deliberation. Paris had ousted 2 governments, and they could do it again. Further problems were caused by the coup itself. The Jacobins were now the convention, and so had inherited all of the Girondins' baggage, all their many failures, empty promises, half-measures, and most critically, their losing war. In the Jacobins' moment of vulnerability, Georges Danton and Maximilien Robespierre were yet again to leave their indelible marks upon the revolution. They realized very quickly that they would have to traverse a political minefield. Firstly, they would have to manage inevitable anti-Jacobin backlash that would soon grip the departments. Secondly, they would need to keep the insurrectionary Commune constrained, but not with such heavy-handed measures as to incite a coup like that which so recently had unseated the Girondins. And the third point, how in a more general sense could the Jacobin Club be strengthened to meet these challenges? So first off, backlash. Almost immediately after taking control of the convention, the Jacobins were finding out what happens when you make a cake and eat it too. Only some of this backlash came from within Paris. While the Commune was obviously quite supportive of the new government, the same could not be said for the ousted Girondins. Over 70 of the Girondins who remained in the convention issued an official letter of protest declaiming the violent coup. But again, within Paris, the Jacobins were protected from this kind of political theatre. The same could not be claimed out in the departments. Instead of the desired fait accompli, regional and municipal authorities, ostensibly loyal to the National Convention, declared in favour of the Girondins. Naturally, the Girondins themselves were quick to capitalise, inciting revolts against populism in Paris. Their incitements tapped into the federalist movement out in the departments, especially in the south, Normandy, or in regions containing sizable non-French populations. From July to August, 60 departments of 83 joined this federalist movement. So maybe not a federalist movement, but a federalist revolt. And it's easier to understand why so many departments were heading in this direction. The further out you got from Paris, the more Girondins could be found. What's more, these Girondins had been democratically elected. Quite justifiably, the Jacobins' assumption of national control was deemed both undemocratic and illegal. I could probably have done with noting this a bit earlier, but political divides not just within the National Convention, but across the Republic more generally, assumed a very regional character. The French Republic, far from being one and indivisible, was riven by regional rivalries. And in the maelstrom of the revolution, these rivalries had become heavily politicized to a point where entire regions voted fairly homogeneously for a single faction, Montagnard or Girondin. Thus departmental delegations elected to the convention carried strong regional ties that were oftentimes stronger than factional affiliations. And with the ouster of the Girondins in June of 1793, the general trend out in the departments was decidedly anti-Jacobin. Though that did not mean the Federalist revolt was unified. Far from it, the Federalist revolt was disjointed and dispersed, united only in their condemnation of the anti-democratic coup in Paris. Only some revolts were outright pro-Girondin, that is to say launched in an attempt to reinstall the Girondins to the convention. Most Federalist revolts were narrowly regional, eschewing national politics almost entirely. The revolt of Pasquale Paoli was the best example. The island of Corsica had been purchased from the Genoese Republic in the 1760s, and the local people had not taken to the French occupation very well. Rebels had taken to the hills from day one, and it took decades to reach an uneasy compromise in which the main patrician families laid down their arms in exchange for benefits within the Ancien regime. Pasquale Paoli was one such former rebel, and when the king was guillotined, and France looked like it was going to get its ass kicked by a pan-European coalition, Paoli picked up his gun and induced others to do the same. Back in France, pockets of Federalist revolt flared up not far from the capital, in and around Normandy. Pro-revolutionary and counter-revolutionary towns and cities in the Vendée, in the midst of their own regional civil war, took the opportunity to assume a federalist position. Federalism was strongest in the south, especially in the Girondins' stronghold of, no surprise, the Gironde. Here, Gironde federalists wanted to establish either an interconnected series of French republics, or a fully independent state. Dispute over just what this future might look like rapidly spilled out into civil war in the south, centering on Lyon, Marseille and Toulon. Even as federalist and counter-revolutionary revolts swamped the Jacobins, they faced a threat from within Paris, their second hurdle. The simple truth was that the Jacobins were in charge only by the grace of the insurrectionary Commune. The minute they stepped out of line or failed to meet the demands of the people, then the same fate which had befallen the Girondins awaited the Jacobins. Taking the lead was the Committee of Public Safety, and in particular Danton. Both he and the committee spent much of July drafting radical economic and political reforms, which were then ratified by the convention. The economic reforms continued much of the Jacobins' already radical program of interventionism, and took the form of further price controls. Political reforms were similarly radical. The Jacobins promised a new constitution, one that would guarantee universal male-female suffrage, the abolition of slavery, the right to work, public welfare, and a free state education. The active-passive distinction would be completely discarded. The intention behind these reforms was obvious: to mollify the Commune. And in that respect, results were mixed. The constitution was transparently political, a vague promise made to get the Commune, the Enragés and the Sans-Culottes to simmer down. And the economic reforms, though a step in the right direction, as ever fell short of the leap demanded by the Enragés. Especially noteworthy was the committee's soft touch towards supposed grain hoarders. Jacques Roux, a leading Enragé, was a prominent figure on economic matters. The people were destitute and starving, as Roux rightly pointed out, and the Jacobins did have the power to stop it, yet they failed to go far enough. Roux pushed incessantly for grain speculators and grain hoarders to be sent to the guillotine, a length to which the Jacobins were very reluctant to resort. Between the Committee of Public Safety and the National Convention, the Jacobins should have had the institutional power needed to really solidify their position, to overcome that third challenge. But alas, they succeeded in merely keeping afloat, treading water as the ocean boiled. Particular scrutiny ought to be levelled at Danton as leader of the Committee of Public Safety. We've already seen that he had a fairly conciliatory disposition, an admirable trait normally, but perhaps not the ideal temperament in a moment of existential crisis. Thus his efforts were often hampered by his own unwillingness to bring the hammer down. He had the committee suspend much of its suppression of the Enragés, and didn't push the Commune to dissolve their work completed. It was his committee's economic policies which failed to satisfy the Enragés. Perhaps most damningly of all, it was Danton who attempted to negotiate with both federalist and foreign diplomats, hoping to bring about a peace. Invariably, these negotiations were a waste of time, serving only to further embarrass a man whose failures were now hanging like chains around his neck. By early July, the committee really was losing control of the situation. Jacques Roux and other Enragés endorsed taxation populaire, in which the people themselves determined how much they were willing to pay, the inevitable result of inadequately radical policy from on high. Store owners and merchants found their properties occupied and wares seized. They were compelled to sell everything from soap and grain to butter and wine at cut-rate prices, much to the dismay of the Jacobins. To put a stop to this nonsense, the committee took uncharacteristically harsh action. They successfully induced the Cordier Club to disavow Roux. Then, to fully neutralize him as a threat, Jean-Paul Marat and the Jacobin propaganda machine leveled Roux's reputation with sustained attacks on his character and politics. Though these actions did eliminate Roux as a threat, the other Enragés didn't take the hint, and kept up their incessant demands for stronger economic policy and harsher punishments for counter-revolutionaries. The myriad pressures from above and below, from foreign armies and domestic enemies, proved to be incredibly stressful for the Jacobins, and I mean that in a literal, psychological sense. Staring down the barrel at a losing war, and fearing that the revolution may be lost, even Robespierre was struggling. On June 12, to a collection of fellow Jacobins, he signalled his intention to resign. "I no longer have the strength," he said. 4 years of difficult and fruitless work, I sense that my physical and moral resources are no longer at a level required by a great revolution. Protest from his fellows convinced Robespierre to remain, so in a more cynical read perhaps he feigned doubt to solidify his position. Either way, with a second wind at his back, Robespierre set about digging France out of its grave. He made the bold statement that France must have a single will: it must be Republican or it must be Royalist. And then, perhaps Robespierre's most famous coinage: the French Republic must be one and indivisible. To that end, he and others dispatched memos and drafted laws that would assure the integrity of the Republic. Censorship was introduced in full, new conscription laws promulgated, state resources would be nationalized, rebels killed without appeal, enemies of the Republic found, arrested, and tried. This slew of new laws contradicted much of what had been put to paper in the new Constitution of 1793, completed on June 24th. As we saw, in December of 1792, Vergniaud, Condorcet, Brissot and a handful of other Girondins joined Danton, Sieyès and Barrère in drafting a new constitution. Predictably, as the Girondins held sway at this stage, the document proved to be much too limp-wristed for the Montagnards' liking. By April, it was stark divergences of opinion over individual property rights that ground progress to a halt. A draft was sent to the Jacobin Club, publicly rejected by Robespierre, and so the stalemate continued. This stalemate was only broken in June with the ouster of the Girondins. Robespierre still thought that the constitution was necessary, so he had his trusted protégé Saint-Just lead a committee that would make edits. In keeping with Robespierre's vision that the Montagnards had to adopt a radical policy to bring the people in line, he made it plain that this constitution would have to repudiate bourgeois property politics so sacred to the Girondins and Federalists. Saint-Just wrote up articles focusing on eliminating poverty and, of course, centralizing power. The result was an exceptionally radical document, demonstrating a strong internalization of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and a thorough repudiation of the bourgeois constitution of 1791. After a declaration that the French Republic was one and indivisible, Section 236 laid out the scope of French citizenship, and it was pretty inclusive, not only accounting for existing French-born citizens, but denoting clearly the path to citizenship for non-French-born residents, a move that only galvanized support from among German, Italian, and Walloon communities. That all being so, the Constitution stipulated that not only could citizenship be lost if one cooperated with a foreign power, but more than that, civil rights could be stripped away. This would apply to citizens currently awaiting trial. Under this constitution, they would have no rights unless found innocent. As the general will of the French people was still the basis of government legitimacy, civic participation in the form of voting was an important component of the new constitution. All citizens could vote. Because citizenship included women, this meant women could legally vote. Voluntary elections would be annual, start in May, and elect by majority one deputy per 40,000 citizens. The deputy to be representative of their constituent region, but still beholden to the national electorate. Sections 45 through 55 went into detail about the legislative body, tentatively dubbed the National Assembly, which was meant to replace the National Convention. They had the power to propose and pass laws, collect taxes, declare war, etc., etc. There were a few interesting bits to note though. All sessions would be public, all notes public record, and had to have a rump of 200 members out of a theoretical 600 plus, for a given session to be legally binding. In the spirit of equality, all decisions had to pass by a majority vote, and speakers spoke in the order they requested to speak. Parting from the norm, the Constitution called for an executive council, there to manage state administration and enforce the laws of the Assembly. They actually had a decent amount of power, controlling the army and having the right to conduct diplomacy. No doubt Saint-Just intended for the council's 24 seats to be stuffed with his mates, giving the Montagnards even more control. Sections 75 through 84 covered administrative organisation, basically just trying to enforce transparency and accountability on the electoral colleges and departmental assemblies. Sections 85 through 100 were interesting, codifying the existing system. All civil rights were uniform across the Republic, judicial positions were to remain elected, and citizens had the right to defend themselves in court, judged by their peers. Among other things, trials were public affairs, and the accused would have access to legal counsel. Section 101 explicitly stated that no citizen was tax exempt. The next two sections declared that state finances were public record and administered by trusted agents. Sections 107 to 114 focused on the army. It established that there would always be, even in times of peace, a standing army and navy. To quote Section 109, all Frenchmen are soldiers, and thus it was clear that the entire nation was required to provide military expenses and supplies. Furthermore, the army was beholden to civilian authorities and forbidden from exercising political power. Sections 115 to 117 laid out the framework for constitutional amendments. They were possible and required the convening of all elected assemblies to determine if there were grounds for said amendment. Sections 118 to 121 briefly covered foreign affairs. The French Republic respected the sovereignty of all other states if France's sovereignty was respected in turn. All peoples who sought liberty were friends of France and could seek asylum. And finally, there could be no peace until all foreign armies had left French soil. Sections 122 to 124, the last few thank God, are probably the most interesting. To quote, "The Constitution guarantees equality, liberty, security, property, public debt, freedom of worship, public relief," that basically means welfare, freedom of the press, the right to assembly, and the enjoyment of the rights of man. This was the beating heart of the Constitution of 1793. A popular, uncompromising appeal to liberty for all Frenchmen. It was all about freedom and liberty. Unlike a lot of other constitutions even today, there was nothing calling for Frenchmen to be loyal. It was self-evident that if the Republic did its job, the loyalty would be organic. Which is why it's such a shame that the Constitution of 1793 was never enacted. After being signed off by Robespierre, current convention president Aubois, and a general vote, its implementation was suspended. This was done on the recommendation of Bertrand Barrère, a member of the Committee of Public Safety. Like the rest of the Montagnards, he genuinely believed in the Constitution, The sticking point was that it required a new legislative body, a renewed National Assembly, and calling a national vote, organising that whilst fighting a war, was completely unfeasible. By October, it was officially shelved as the convention adopted a policy of emergency government until the peace. So really, the constitution must be seen as a statement of intent, and in that sense it was still very much in line with the publicly stated principles of the Montagnard, emphasising equality, liberty and fraternity to the hilt. Already much of the spirit of the constitution was observed. The legal system was basically already in place, the army and navy were already supported by the entire nation, but still it would have been nice to have things like the abolition of slavery become constitutional requirements. This was still a good constitution though. It was extremely radical by the standards of the day. Hell, it had worked fine even to this day, and indeed was used as inspiration for many democratic revolutionaries throughout the 19th century. Things like the right to assembly, controls on property, and public education were catnip for the Enragés. They'd been calling for this stuff for months now. So the constitution did at least have that effect, calm things down in Paris, and get the Enragés off of the Montagnards' back, at least for a little while. The spell was broken in July. On the day of July 13th, Jean-Paul Marat was at his home on the rue de Correilly, accompanied only by his girlfriend, Simone Evade. Though home, Marat was not relaxing. Far from idle, he was busy penning editorials and editing articles for L'Ami du Peuple. On this particular day, Marat was expecting a guest, an out-of-towner from his native Normandy. 24-year-old Charlotte Corday had arrived in Paris some days earlier, intending to meet Marat. Her reasons for doing so were suspected by Marat. He did not know her, nor she him. Still, she was insistent, demanding an audience not once but twice. Both times she was left hanging. Not so for Corday's third attempt. Promising to regale Marat with the sordid political happenings of Normandy, and to provide a list of suspected counter-revolutionaries, Marat's sister organised a meeting. Corday expected Marat to be very invested in what she had to say, as Normandy was proving to be a hotbed of Federalist and Girondin agitation. At that very moment, Robert Lindet was acting as the representative on mission, and though he would gain control of the situation, his current predicament was not helped by the recent escape of Marguerite-Élie Corday, who had taken refuge in Caen. Upon entering the home, Corday found Marat nestled in his bath. The reason for his neurotic tendencies was revealed. Marat suffered from a debilitating skin condition he had contracted a few years prior. Warm water filled with mineral additives eased the pain caused by blistering, broken skin. Wasting no time, Corday told Marat what she knew, finishing up with a list of Girondins she suspected of counter-revolutionary activities. As Marat recorded these names, reportedly even remarking that those listed would surely be guillotined, Corday unsheathed a long, sharp kitchen knife she had hidden in her bodice. In an instant, she lunged for Marat and plunged the knife deep into his chest. This killing blow pierced the left lung and severed the aorta of the heart. With the last of the air remaining in his one good lung, Marat expelled an exasperated shriek. This desperate cry was heard by Evade, who rushed in to offer what aid she could, just as Corday calmly exited the room. But alas, there was nothing Evade could do. Pressing the wound tightly, she was powerless as Marat slipped into unconsciousness, never to wake. All this commotion had alerted Marat's secretary. He rushed upstairs to find Corday, her arm slick with blood. Taking a chair, the secretary beat Corday into the ground and followed up with a few well-deserved kicks and punches. Subdued, Corday made no attempt to escape. As it turned out, she had never intended to leave Paris alive. In her possession was a letter titled Address to the French, which spelled out her motives. She was the daughter of minor nobility, and had benefited mightily from an education at a convent. Literate and lively, the young Corday had gravitated towards the writings of the philosophes. The idea she encountered transformed her into no less an ardent revolutionary as Marat had been. Remaining in Normandy, she had been one of the hundreds of thousands of women to brave reprisal and intimidation to spread the revolution. After the Journées of May and June dispersed Girondins far and wide, Corday had attended the speeches and meetings of those who found refuge up north. She became a ready convert to the Girondin project. And as the Girondins assumed a federalist mantle, she too adopted this position. Offering her services, Corday volunteered to go to Paris to act as their spy. But her reasons for volunteering for such a dangerous assignment were twofold. Sure, she wanted to help her fellow Girondin, but Corday had a notion of just how best she could serve the cause. Little did the Girondins know, but their spy was really an assassin. Corday had been told of the Journée and how the deceitful Marat had humiliated them at his acquittal. She was particularly aggrieved by his demands to the convention that no mercy be shown to the Girondins, that the mob should be armed with, quote, pitchforks, scythes, pikes, guns and sabres, and let loose to hunt down the Montagnards' enemies. This serpent had to die, a lesson to the rest of his ilk. A mission Corday planned and executed to perfection. She would face trial immediately, claiming, in her defence, that she had killed one man to save 1,000. Corday was executed by guillotine in the Place de Grève on July 17th. Despite the nasty blow dealt by the death of one of the Jacobin triumvirate, and certainly the most popular revolutionary in Paris, Robespierre made hay of his colleague's unjust murder. Something similar had happened in April, when beloved sans-culotte Claude Lozovsky had succumbed to a bout of illness. Lozovsky got a brief mention for his role in the August insurrection, you may recall. Robespierre had then, as now, seen the propaganda value, and personally delivered Lozovsky's eulogy, further cementing his own revolutionary reputation. This time round, Robespierre called upon the painter and a Montagnard member of the convention, Jacques-Louis David, to immortalize Marat. As a member of the Committee of General Security, his efforts focused mainly on the arts and propaganda. David was well suited to organising a stirring, patriotic funeral. For 6 hours the funeral procession trundled along, children carrying bundles of flowers to mask the scent of rotting flesh. The whole affair was attended by all revolutionaries, who, though they had feuded with and even disliked Marat in life, all recognised that in death he was greater than them all. As a painter, David was also asked by Robespierre to paint Marat. Initially, David had hoped to paint Marat in situ, lying recumbent in the bath. This stylistic imperative was thwarted by warm weather, leading to advanced decay. Subalternatively, he depicted Marat's lavish funeral, later returning to imagine Marat's demise. Marat's assassination was not unique. At the beginning of the year, another prominent Montagnard named Louis Lepelletier was assassinated in a café on the night of Louis' execution, right under the committee's nose. A few days after Marat's assassination, the leader of the Lyon Jacobin, Joseph Chalier, was murdered by Federalist rebels. Upon his watch, Danton had failed to protect 3 popular radical politicians. And with all of his other failings adding fuel to the fire, the stage was set for a leadership spill. But to get to grips with the coming crisis, it's necessary to understand how the various revolutionary committees were organised. At the centre, naturally, was the National Convention. As we saw back in April, the convention had seen fit to support Isnard's proposal that a small committee be called to organise the defence of Paris. This committee was, of course, the Committee of Public Safety. Under Danton's leadership, the Committee of Public Safety had a pretty free hand to do what it deemed necessary. Apart from Danton's political activities carried out under the committee's cover, representatives on mission were also, technically, under the committee's control. And as the representatives had their fingers on the pulse of the departments and the armies, the Committee of Public Safety exercised a lot of direct control over national defence and administration. This power was concentrated in the hands of 9 permanent committee members. Since its formation, the membership had changed somewhat, and by July of 1793, it consisted of a few familiar names: Bertrand Barrère, Georges Couthon, Thomas-Augustin de Gasperon, André Jambon, Robert Lindet, Pierre Prieur, Saint-Just, Jacques-Alexis Thuriot, and of course Georges Danton. The Committee of Public Safety shared their power with another committee, though their functions were quite different. The Committee of General Security had succeeded the Committee of Surveillance in October of 1792, and was thus tasked with rooting out and arresting suspected counter-revolutionaries in cooperation with local police. Once arrested, the committee would collate whatever evidence there was to be found and refer the suspect to the Revolutionary Tribunal. So basically, they were an intelligence and counter-espionage service. Much like the Committee of Public Safety, the Committee of General Security was staffed by a handful of permanent members, each delegated specific tasks and duties. So to get back to it, Danton was on thin ice. By mid-July, it had become impossible for the committee to retain the services of their founder, and he was jettisoned. Gasperon too was let go owing to poor health on the 27th. To replace them was none other than Maximilien Robespierre. With Marat dead and Danton sidelined, the revolutionary triumvirate was ended. No love lost, Robespierre immediately began to distance both himself and the Montagnard from Danton. But this was a difficult task, and almost immediately he felt pressure to meet the Enragés' demands that grain hoarders, speculators and the like face the guillotine should they be found guilty. Furthermore, he took proactive steps to rectify grain shortages by requisitioning large warehouses and stuffing them full of grain. Whilst these measures were gratifying to the Enragés, it wasn't lost upon them that the committee had made these arrangements under duress. Evidently, it would still take direct action to get their way. Leading the radical voices calling for more aggressive measures was propagandist Jacques Hébert. Though Hébert had been a champion of the Republican cause and enthusiastically supported the execution of Citizen Capet, he had found himself increasingly sidelined as 1793 wore on. In large part, this was due to Marat's rising fame, and as he was installed in various positions of power and gained a massive popular following, Hébert was rapidly eclipsed. Not at all happy to play second fiddle any longer, Hébert had quite cynically shifted his allegiance away from the Montagnard, and thus the National Convention, into full-throated support for the Enragés. And with Marat's death and the silencing of Jacques Roux, Hébert was left standing as the most influential and most popular of all the Enragés. His followers, named the Hébertistes, were unrelenting in their denunciation of Danton, the Committee of Public Safety, the Convention, really anyone that Hébert targeted in his popular newspaper, Le Père Duchesne. And it was with his paper that Hébert gained followers not just from among the sans-culottes, but also those in power. Quietly, many Jacobins were coming around to Hébert's populist position, placing pressure on Robespierre and the party old guard to endorse radical economic and political reform. It was to be Billaud Varenne and Herbois who became the club's most assured Hébertists. Faith in the Republic, and the Montagnards specifically, had been badly shaken by so many political defeats, economic woes, and as we'll get into in a minute, military reversals. Sometimes this harm done to the Republic can be overstated though. The Convention had a lot of shooters out there, not just in Paris, but out in the departments too. They could count among their allies the self-described patriots, urban intelligentsia and sans-culottes, who thrived in France's other cities. They had a pretty loyal army too, staffed by reliable officers at the lower levels. Rural peasants were fairly apathetic, but this was fine, as they were only really openly hostile in a few regions, namely the Vendée. Plenty of Federalist revolts were gaining steam, especially now that surviving Girondins could be counted among their number. But even while, say, the Corsicans or the Catalans or the Bretons or the Occitans were agitating for independence, Germans, Italians, Walloons and Jews were fairly staunch supporters of the Convention. The black population too was pretty favourable towards the Republic, well, at least outside of Haiti. Again, the Haitian Revolution is ongoing at this stage, and former slaves are in open revolt against the Republic. Many, however, who lived in or happened to be in the metropole, liked the Republic. In September of 1792, the Convention greenlit the formation of an all-black cavalry squadron called the Legion of St. George, named after one of their founding officers, the multi-talented Georges Boulogne, the Comte de Saint-Georges, a renowned officer, fencer, and composer. The Legion is particularly remarkable because it had black officers too, which was completely unheard of at this stage. They were to serve in a larger Légion Américaine, made up of volunteers from French colonies. The Legion of St. George was not only the first all-black unit in European service, but it also fought exclusively in Europe. They took part in Dumouriez's Belgian campaign, earning some distinction. Saint-Georges and other senior officers were detained after Dumouriez's betrayal, but fortunately evaded a guillotine. The famed Black Count, Thomas Alexandre Dumas, was given the Legion in the meantime. Another unlikely ally the Montagnards could boast was women from all walks of life. As I've said once before, I'm going to have to do a whole thing on women in the Revolution, because there's just too much to say right now. Suffice to say, the Convention was actually taking proactive steps towards gender equality by 1793. Countering some sexist claims of gender inferiority by one of his colleagues, Georges Couthon said in August, "Woman is born with as many capacities as man. If she has not demonstrated it until now, it is not the fault of nature, but rather our prior institutions." In revolutionary propaganda, femininity and motherhood were openly adopted for their potent symbolism. Jacques-Louis David, serving as what was basically the Minister of Propaganda, was a very busy man, and right around the time he was dealing with Marat's funeral, he was coming off of weeks of planning 1793's Fête de la Fédération. This grand affair was then to be outdone by a celebration to commemorate the first-year anniversary of the August insurrection. David had representatives from all of France attend, one for every canton and every department, literally thousands of people. While the main celebration took place in the Place de la Révolution, where symbols of tyranny were burned in huge bonfires, David had the departmental representatives do some pretty weird shit. In a square near the partially demolished Bastille was set up a so-called Fountain of Regeneration. It was a big statue in the likeness of the Egyptian goddess Isis, from whose boobs shot spouts of water. The representatives were encouraged to douse themselves in the water. Bit weird, but okay. Closer to his own wheelhouse, David also unveiled the Louvre during the celebrations. It had been an art college for some time, until the National Assembly had declared that it ought to become an art museum instead, open to the public. To my knowledge, it's the first public museum ever. At the very least, it's the first in French history. Most of the collection was confiscated from Versailles, the nearby Tuileries, or the Gallic Church, who didn't have much need for fine art anymore. All of these developments in the arts and culture took place against the backdrop of a rapidly deteriorating military situation. The Republic, held the whole revolution, was contending with existential peril. Back in February, when things had looked good and French armies were on the advance, the Republic had declared war upon the United Provinces, Spain and the United Kingdom. Though it was likely that these states would eventually join the coalition against France, to jump the gun and bring them in early had been a mistake. While the Dutch and British armies were paltry compared to the French army, their navies were not so outclassed. The Royal Navy was undoubtedly the finest in the world, and backed up by the Dutch, they would not only outnumber the French, but also outperform them. With little hope of challenging her enemies in the high seas, France was soon blockaded, dealing a stinging blow to the French economy and devastating coastal communities, especially the major trading ports. Worth mentioning too is that this British blockade kept the Republic pretty much in the dark about what was going on in its colonies. This compounded the problem posed by Spain because by now Haiti was a few years into its revolution. Without any way to consistently contact the colony, nor offer aid or reinforcements, Saint-Domingue was left to fend for itself. Armies of former slaves roaming about the mountainous interiors of Haiti were offered funds and later commissions in the Spanish army, if only they would agree to fight the hated First Republic. Safe to say, France had bitten off more than it could chew. To rectify the situation, the determination was made to kick the levée en masse into overdrive. Every resource the nation could muster had to be directed towards the war effort. Spearheading this effort was Lazare Carnot. Now already, Carnot had been hard at work cajoling, corralling and coercing every gun, bullet, recruit, horse and bushel of wheat he could. But it was here in 1793 that he truly earned his title as the organiser of victory, not long after he won election to the Committee of Public Safety. Of most immediate concern was manpower. The armies were perennially short of soldiers, lost as they were to a vicious mix of disease, combat losses and desertion. Desertion was particularly devastating. Unable to be properly provisioned or paid by the convention, over 35,000 troops, 6% of the army's strength, deserted in the first half of 1793. The levée of 300,000 troops made the previous year had fallen short of projections, and turned out pretty well all of the willing recruits there were to be found. So in 1793, Carnot was forced to scrape the bottom of the barrel, and he called for 2 more nationwide recruitment drives, one in February and one in March. But Carnot was not merely content to call for new men. He tried his best to follow the convention's demands that France have an all-volunteer recruiting process. Despite hopes that an all-volunteer army might be formed though, the reality was that not enough men were joining. Stunts like the militarised Fête de la Fédérés of early 1792 had turned out tens of thousands of eager volunteers. But this was not the making of a professional, permanent army. Still, to raise and replace troops, the convention were loath to resort to the Ancien Regime's unjust racolage system, and had instead seen fit to impose a lottery system, not unlike a 20th century draft. But just like the racolage, this too was unpopular, unjust, and as it turned out, ineffective. Draftees, after being voluntold to join, took to the forests. Another solution was needed. Thus begun was the Scrutin Révolutionnaire, which replaced both the lottery and volunteering. From the largest cities to the most remote hamlets, local communities were expected to nominate groups of young men to serve on their community's behalf. They would be equipped at the community's expense. Whilst in theory this system allowed local communities to provide what they could, the whole system was rife with abuses and loopholes, and in the end it was always the poorest families who suffered the most. If you could cough up the coin, a replacement could go on your behalf. Lotteries could be rigged, administrators bribed. Sometimes entire families were called up at once. For a family farm or business, this was literally fatal, leaving them with no money coming in, and thus no hope of paying for food. Despite the Scrutin's shortcomings, it was not abandoned. In fact, the convention did the opposite, and doubled down. Local administrators were expected to fulfill impossible quotas, and so resorted to coercive measures to meet demand. Measures which were accepted as necessary by the convention, called up were the old and infirm, boys not much older than 10, and criminals of all stripes. The Scrutin was wildly unpopular, and it was in protest to the Scrutin, and the levée en masse more generally, that the Vendée uprising had broken out. Everywhere, communities issued formal petitions and protests demanding that the system be abandoned. Heeding these calls and realising that though the Scrutin was effective, and realising that it cost the convention too much politically, Carnot changed tack. Because the Montagnard now had unrestricted control of the convention, he had no difficulty in reforming the levée's recruiting process, and leaning heavily into taking advantage of patriotism. Blanket restrictions were enforced on all potential recruits. They had to be 18 to 25, unmarried or widowers, and fit for service. Replacements were done away with entirely, and draft dodgers or malingerers were to be punished. Carnot worked hand in glove with the Committee of Public Safety in drafting and enforcing these reforms. And every one of these changes was couched in suitably revolutionary rhetoric. It was the belief of Saint-Just in particular that such propaganda was honey for their medicine. The central conceit was that all Frenchmen would have to sacrifice something for the revolutionary cause, a call which was generally heeded, but that this was not a burden. Rather, it was a solemn duty. To give an example, on August 23rd, the convention issued a declaration that every single Frenchman, man, woman and child, was drafted for the war effort. From this moment until that which the enemy shall be driven from the territory of the French Republic, all French people shall be in permanent requisition for the services of the armies. Young men will go off to fight, married men will forge weapons and ferry food supplies, women will make tents and clothing and provide services in hospitals, children will shred old linen, Old men will be taken to the public squares to offer encouragement and to preach the hatred of kings and the unity of the Republic. In the minds of the people, a spirit of grim, patriotic resolve was instilled. This was done in part with this sort of propaganda. For instance, a Bers Père Duchesne was issued among the troops. A volunteer in the Army du Nord wrote home, "The war which we are fighting is not a war between king and king, or nation against nations. It is a war of liberty against despotism. There can be no doubt that we will be victorious. A nation that is just and free is invincible." Calls for unity and appeals to patriotism were all well and good, but it took Carnot's direct intervention to keep the Levée en Masse going strong. The political momentum he enjoyed as the result of the support of the Committee of Public Safety was certainly of great benefit, and gave him the cover he needed to form what was coming to be known as the Armée de Masse. The cornerstone of this new French army would be universal conscription. Whilst universal conscription is typically detested wherever it's implemented, it was actually quite popular in 1793. The Enragés in Paris and radicals all over France had long called for universal conscription. And for the peasants and workers subject to conscription, well, it wasn't really any worse than what had come before. This is because universal really was the operative term. Wealth and status meant nothing. Sons of rich merchants were conscripted just as easily as low-level shit shovelers. The effects were manifest almost immediately. In August and September, recruitment was way up from the previous year. The deficits caused by the Revolt of the Vendée were made up, and fresh new battalions pressed into service. Of course, regional divides hampered Carnot's best efforts. The central and eastern departments, the ones where revolutionary energies were high, or most threatened by enemy invasion, supplied fully armed and equipped battalions. In the south and southwest, however, where the Federalist revolts were strongest, comparatively few battle-ready battalions were forthcoming, leading representatives on mission to be focused on these departments. Resistance to recruitment did occur, but was notably diminished from the high watermark in February. Carnot was ruthlessly pragmatic, and realised early on that the Levée en Masse was perhaps months from yielding the fully equipped, trained and ready battalions demanded by the convention. So he focused heavily on setting up the general system, which could later be scaled up. By year's end, when the Levée was in full swing, it would pump out another 300,000 fully equipped and trained troops, for a total of 700,000 people under arms. Though only young men were eligible for active combat service, everyone else was subject to whatever forms of labour the army might require. Specifically, the civilians were put to work rectifying the Republic's lack of supplies. Throughout 1793, reports had flooded into the Committee of Public Safety regarding severe deficiencies of food, equipment and uniforms. In their own words, these soldiers were without boots, tormented by scabies, and eaten by vermin. As often happened in situations like this, the troops were forced to take side jobs to make ends meet, or forage for food. Robert Lindet, joined by Pierre Prieur, took over the Commission of Subsistence. Lindet and Prieur tried their best, but invariably found food production incapable of meeting demand. Thus, Carnot's universal conscription was a godsend, and allowed the Commission to utilise the full productive capacity of the nation to supply the war effort. The National Convention also freed up funds for the establishment of weapon manufactories, which ended up churning out 1,000 muskets a day. The funds themselves were hard to come by, since the Republic was actually honouring the debt incurred by the Ancien Regime and the Constitutional Order. In August, Joseph Cambon issued the Great Book of the Public Debt, which offered 5% interest to France's creditors. You might think such a high interest rate was crippling, but it enticed Dutch and British banks to continue to lend to the French government. In fact, it was so weird that as Britain and the United Provinces were at war with France, their agents travelled to and from Paris, negotiating with their French counterparts. A lingering financial committee member from the National Assembly, the Baron de Batz, organised many of these efforts. This gave him a degree of latitude and put him in free contact with foreigners. The revolutionaries rightly suspected that he was up to no good. Regardless, none of these gargantuan financial, economic or military efforts went unrewarded. Lindet and Prieur got grain production up to wartime levels, Cambon rose in both power and influence, and Carnot, when he pushed, quite firmly, that the army be given a degree of latitude in appointing its own officers and handling of internal affairs, he was heeded. The Armée en Masse was primed and ready for action. The focus of this renewed army would not be on foreign enemies, but rather enemies at home. And that meant more than anything else the Vendéans. Where we last left off was in February, when the uprising had just begun, and a few thousand pissed-off peasants had defeated local National Guard units. Well, almost immediately after their victories, there was a lull. It wasn't until March, and the National Convention demanded an additional levy, that the uprising really exploded. Peasant insurgents were formed into an effective guerrilla army, even boasting cavalry squadrons and captured cannon. This was the work of royalist officers who had fled to the Vendée, or foreign officers sympathetic to their cause. This newly christened Catholic army went on the attack. In response, the convention had General Marseille detach the Army of the West from the Army of the Interior to try and restore order. But this was a tough gig for Marseille. Not only were his men fearful of ending up like the unfortunate victims of Machecoul, but aside from a core of a few thousand regulars, his army was made up of ill-trained and ill-fed volunteers. Worse still, he felt like he had to be everywhere at once. So despite having a sizable force of 50,000 men, Marseille split them up. Small units of a few dozen were sent into villages, enough to stir up trouble, but not to end it. Larger columns of troops were intercepted and destroyed in detail. As the Catholic army was oriented towards irregular warfare, whenever they were pressed by Marseille's large columns, they would simply melt away, and rely upon the support of pious peasants for requisitions and recruits. In the meanwhile, pressure was mounting on the coastal cities of the Vendée, namely La Rochelle, which was partially besieged by the rebels and blockaded by the British. To protect this vital port city, the convention appointed veteran of the American War, General Armand Louis Gantot, known more commonly as General Biron. He took command of a new army called the Army of the Coast of La Rochelle, formed on April 30th. Biron had at his disposal a force of reliable veteran battalions and unruly conscripts and volunteers. Arrayed against him were 3 enemy armies, amassing something north of 60,000 men. These men were led by a host of capable officers, usually sons of the old rural aristocracy. When the Vendée rebellion had first flared, local peasant communities, eager and ready to fight, recognized their lack of officers as a critical shortcoming. Some local popular peasant leaders were forthcoming. 2 examples spring to mind. Jean-Nicolas Stofflet was a soldier's son working as a game warden, and Jacques Cataleneux was a wagon driver. But these guys didn't have too much military experience, so envoys had been sent out to the manorial estates of the old nobility, entreating them to join the rebellion. Initially, the nobles had been standoffish. Though sympathetic, they were unsure of victory. A strong sense of regionalism, however, compelled many to take positions of military authority in the budding rebellion. Without fail, all had been old royalist officers of the army and navy, and they included Maurice d'Elbée, the Marquis de Montchamp, François de Charette, and Henri de la Roche-Jacqueline. They functioned like warlords or caudillos, recruiting from a specific region, and thereby gaining a loyal personal following. Whilst later on this personalist mode of recruitment and organisation would damage the Catholic army's ability to coordinate, for now at least, it was a great strength. In their first few expeditions, the Catholic armies demonstrated a peerless mastery of guerrilla warfare, preferring to fight in forest whenever they could. They patrolled the waterways in gunboats, and even sent coded messages via windmill. They also boasted a primitive ambulance service, ferrying wounded away from the fight. The Catholic army was perfectly capable of fighting a pitched battle over open ground. With each passing day, the Catholic army gained strength. Decrees bearing the name of the boy King Louis XVII went out calling for support, as rebel parishes organised food drives and provided funds for arms. Training from royalist officers, supplies stolen or requisitioned, and deserters from republican forces, and pretty soon, the Catholic army had control of the entirety of Brittany. Only the Vendée itself remained in contention. Confident of victory, the Catholics went on the offensive in March, with Roche-Jacqueline capturing Bressuire on the 3rd. A few days later, and the Catholic army defeated a sizable republican force guarding the approaches to the city of Thouars. Outflanked and forced to fall back into the city, it was only a few hours before the garrison surrendered, yielding the Vendée rebels a cachet of vital gunpowder and munitions. In a show of mercy, the garrison was allowed to leave untouched, but it wasn't long before such decency was abandoned. Despite their success, one of Biron's subordinates defeated a rebel force on May 16th, capturing or destroying most of their artillery. However, a short while later, he too was defeated, and in turn lost most of Biron's cannon. Not long after that, General Marseille was overwhelmed near Grand-Lay, and his troops fled before the battle was even on. Likewise, on the 22nd, brief skirmishing broke a Republican force of 300, though they did face an entire rebel army of 20,000. The rest of May went well for the rebels, until, by month's end, almost all of the Vendée holdout cities were captured. Only the port cities of Nantes, La Rochelle and Brest remained uncaptured. Even before suffering such stinging defeats, the convention had seen fit to send reinforcements to the Vendée. But in a taste of things to come, instead of entrusting command of these reinforcements to old guard officers of the Royal Army, men like Biron, they instead called up the representatives on mission and other revolutionaries with military experience. Thus Jean-Antoine Rossignol was given command of a militia company in April, and Antoine Santerre entrusted with 12 volunteer battalions from Paris. Santerre took these volunteers and arrived at Saumur to join the defenders there. They were led by Napoleon's future chief of staff, General Berthier. An abortive attempt was made to use Saumur as a launching pad for a counter-offensive, but quick thinking saw the Catholic army blunt the offensive. Ill-disciplined volunteers streamed back into Saumur, leaving the town vulnerable. After all but destroying a relief column, Cataleneux attacked Saumur on the 9th, crushing Berthier and Santerre, as well as taking several cannon. Berthier withdrew to lick his wounds and plan a counterattack, while Santerre wrestled to justify his actions. The rebels, meanwhile, could scarcely make sense of all their successes. As the nobility ran the war and the peasants did the fighting and dying, The priests had formed the respectable civilian wing of the Vendée Rebellion. Conscious that this was now a civil war, the self-appointed Grand Council felt it necessary to justify their actions. Co-opting the language of the revolutionaries, they issued the address to the French. They accused the revolutionaries back in Paris of having unleashed the Genie Revolution, and in so doing reduced France to a state of civil war. To quote, "You have introduced atheism in the place of religion, anarchy in the place of laws, men who are tyrants in the place of a king who was our father." The rebel cause was, in their own words, the holiest and most just. It was the cause of God and the King. Quote, "We know the true wish of France. It is our own wish, to preserve forever our Roman Catholic religion, and to have a king who will serve us as father and protector." In both action and intent, the Vendée rebels were committed to a holy cause. For them, this was nothing less than a literal Catholic crusade. Keeping the initiative, 2 of the 3 main forces of the Catholic army converged on Nantes in late June, laying the city into siege. The other army swung around to the city of Luçon, but attacked on the 28th, Luçon held firm. The next day, while pounding away with their captured artillery and launching headlong assaults over beaten ground, the rebels did eventually manage to breach the walls and plunge into the city streets. In the thick of street-to-street fighting, the mayor of Nantes personally rallied the defenders. During a charge, Catalonner himself was cut down by Republican musket fire, and the attackers fled in disarray. Exhausted and with morale sapped after the death of a beloved folk hero, the Vendée rebels retreated, leaving behind thousands of dead. At least a few hundred were captured. They were taken out in pairs, tied up, and thrown into the sea. A small force of a few thousand Republican troops was ordered by Biron to launch a diversionary attack towards Nantes, to assist Biron's main force. Unfortunately, the small force was wary after a few days marching. They were soon isolated and overwhelmed at the Battle of Châtillon. Only the cavalry and officers managed to escape. The rest were put to the sword or defected. Still, with Nantes secure, Biron felt bold enough to launch an offensive. Except this time, he ran aground on political shoals, because Santerre had induced the convention to back Berthier's ballsy plan to attack out of a recently recaptured Saumur for a second time. Biron was clearly out of favour, and not at all convinced that his counterparts could pull off such a foolhardy attack, an attack right into those forested heartlands the Vendéens knew so well. He resigned in early July. He was replaced by Rossignol, a position for which the man was horribly ill-equipped to hold. A few days later, a disgusted Biron was recalled to Paris to face the Revolutionary Tribunal, accused of having exhibited a lack of civic virtue. Indeed, Biron was not the only senior officer to be charged under such flimsy pretext, though to be fair, the convention was still on high alert after the Dumouriez debacle. Also in the Vendée, General Marseille was accused of cowardice and incompetency by his attendant representatives on mission, and given the sack. Bertrand Barrère insisted he be court-martialed. General Adam-Philippe Custine met a similar fate. Back in March, he had been on the receiving end of his own bespoke Austrian counterattack. His forces buckled and then melted away. His subsequent efforts to relieve the fortress at Condé had also failed. These failures put Custine in Hébert's sights, and it wasn't long before the general's former royalist sympathies were published by Hébert. Stripped of command, Custine was to be tried before the Revolutionary Tribunal. All 3 generals, Biron, Marseille, and Custine, would face the guillotine soon enough. The trials of Biron and Custine, and Biron's replacement by Rossignol, demonstrated that the convention clearly favoured political reliability to any notion of military competency. That's not to say that loyal Republican officers weren't competent, plenty were, but Rossignol certainly wasn't fit for duty. He set about proving this point almost immediately, looting and wrecking his official lodgings, and stealing Biron's old stuff. He drank, lazed about, and generally neglected his duties. Even as the convention sent reinforcements, proven veterans desperately needed elsewhere, Rossignol let the rebels retake the initiative they had lost in the aftermath of their defeat at Nantes. They gathered in strength, intending to capture Luçon. But in a pitched battle, the rebels were again defeated and forced to withdraw. Reports from the representatives on mission assigned to Rossignol conveyed the opinion that it was not Rossignol's leadership which had held Luçon, but rather his lack of leadership, allowing better men to take charge. Along with all the sordid details about his personal misbehaviour, and the convention recalled Rossignol on August 22nd. And that should have been that. Rossignol gone, another man to take charge. But the war in the Vendée waited for no one, and after another punishing defeat at Chantonnet in early September, the convention reinstated Rossignol at Robespierre's behest. Whilst Rossignol had been away, the officers left in the Vendée had devised what they thought would be a war-winning strategy. Simultaneously, all the Republican forces would launch localized offensive, hopefully overwhelming the rebels. Rossignol reluctantly followed through on the plan, but bungled it badly. This was only partly his fault. The rebels were far more centralized than anticipated, and simply defeated lone columns or army detachments in detail. Every single attack failed, with extreme losses for the Republicans. Defeat in the Vendée was a very probable scenario,